Welcome to This Week of Missouri Politics, our last show of the year. That means one thing. Our very first guest is back to join us. Now, Attorney General Eric Schmitt, welcome back to the show.
It's good to see you can set your watch to me being on the show in December, I guess, right?
We set ours for sure. Let's talk about something, though, that you come into office, and I think there's a perception I had that when they had a rape kit done, I watched like Law & Order SVU, and you follow these things in the paper with the real incidents that happen. You assume there's these rape kits, when they happen, they get tested, and there's some database of a computer somewhere. I think a lot of people were shocked to find that they don't all get tested, and there's a huge backlog. You've taken that on as a personal thing in your office. So far, what's been the progress?
Well, I mean, when we came into office, we made clear our priorities. We want to protect victims, and we want to, stand for the rule of law. And so one of the very first initiatives we announced was our Safe Kit initiative, which was to test, ultimately, all the backlog of all the untested sexual assault kits that are on the state. So the first thing we had to do with the grant money was find out what the landscape is, get an inventory. So the first phase of the grant was to get an inventory. We announced that about a month ago and discovered there are over 6,000 untested sexual assault kits across the state of Missouri. Now, sadly, there are a lot of other states in a similar position, but we want to be a leader on this. And really, our team is guided by the principle that if a victim comes forward, we want to honor that courage to make sure that a kit like that doesn't sit on the shelf untested for years in some evidence room. And so we've got the inventory done. The next phase is to have a tracking system. We already have a working group working on that. And then ultimately the testing, which we think we can move pretty expeditiously on. We've got funding to test.
What is that backlog? What was the backlog when you took this on?
Well, that's what we wanted to determine. And so that's where we got over 6,000 untested kits. So we're going to begin. We've got funding to test about 1,250 of those right away, and we'll be beginning with that shortly, and then also seek more funding to make sure we test all the kits that could be tested. So.
Let's talk about something that you worked on back when you were a senator, but something you probably talked about or referenced at least one of the first times you're ever on the show. It was a law called SB 5. We've all seen it. I mean, I think most folks do support the police. When that window breaks at 3 a.m., you want to call them. But when you're really driving through a town at 57, it can be a little annoying. And some towns just totally rip off their citizens and fund, they fund a whole bureaucracy based off harassing people. You had to build to stop that, to make it to where you couldn't have your entire city budget based off just ripping people off. Now, I found sometimes a little bureaucrat, they take the law, they figure out a way around it. What's been the progress? I'm sure there were there were probably bureaucrats throughout the state that when they saw you went from state treasurer to attorney general, they're like, oh my God, that's the guy. That's the guy that hit our budgets. What have you found as AG? I have a sense there's a few folks that would try to get around that law. Well,
I mean, when we took this on 5 years ago, we made it clear that we did not want people to be treated as ATMs. Yeah. And that was happening in a lot of municipalities and a lot of cities all across the state. It was more pronounced in St. Louis County just because of the density, but it was happening everywhere in a lot of parts of the state. I mean, the original bill was named after Max Creek, which was a sort of a notorious speed trap. And so in rural Missouri and suburban Missouri and urban Missouri, these examples exist. And so now as Attorney General, my job is to enforce the law. And so there's two pieces of that. One is the revenue cap. You can only get so much money from traffic tickets and fines, and the results so far have been good. Statewide, those numbers are down over the last few years, over 40% from traffic tickets and fines. In St. Louis County, down over 60% with traffic tickets and fines, so that's all good. But also what we've discovered now, there are whistleblowers coming forward telling us that there are traffic ticket quotas. And so we had
I always suspected that.
Well, yeah, and some of them are writing and some of them aren't, right? And what we found earlier this year that on a bulletin board, it was write more tickets right away. And so we filed a lawsuit against the city of Diamond. We got a successful resolution of that. Last week, we filed a lawsuit against the city of Marshfield, which is a town off Interstate 44 that went from writing a very few number of tickets to writing a lot of tickets.
Edmund Hubble will be ashamed.
Right, yeah, named after that stretch of the highway, I guess, right? But we had a whistleblower come forward, so we filed a lawsuit. And the message is clear. We're not going to tolerate people being treated like this, because this is an abuse of authority. People don't exist, these cities don't exist to find new and innovative ways to extract more and more money from people to reach into their pockets. And so we're going to hold those officials accountable in Marshfield.
That's interesting. That is, I would think you'll have to do that your entire career as Attorney General, is probably police that one law from the police.
Well, What's really drives us a lot of time are bureaucrats, right? They budget for more revenue from traffic tickets and fines. They want to spend that money, and they find a way to go get that money. I mean, the classic example that we gave in the debate was, St. Anne years ago. Northwest Plaza was the largest mall in the country. It went away. They went from writing 1,000 tickets a year to 10,000 tickets a year. So you don't need to be a rocket scientist to figure out what's going on here. And it's not exclusive to St. Anne, and it's not exclusive to.
Well, but if you ever drove to that airport, you know where St. Anne is.
Yeah, that's right.
Not that you should, but
yeah,
you have
they used to have a speed camera in a hotel room. So some of the examples are pretty extreme. But what's encouraging is that we have people within these cities now are coming forward and say, I don't feel right about this, and they come to us as a whistleblower.
Let's talk about. I mean, people complain about speeding tickets, but boy, you definitely want someone when you get carjacked. And I think a lot of folks thought carjacking wasn't a thing anymore, but that's something that you kind of brought back to the forefront, and you brought up a Safe Streets initiative. Tell somebody that has no idea what we're talking about what that initiative is.
Well, again, I mean, part of the big part of my job is make sure people feel safe, protect victims, uphold the rule of law. And what we're seeing right now is a situation where criminals have been emboldened, and not just in our urban areas, but in other places too. But when you have 3 cities, St. Louis, Kansas City, and Springfield, that are in the top 15 for per capita violent crime rates, something's got to change. So we want to be part of the solution. So we partnered, it's the first of its kind in the country, with U.S. attorneys in both the Eastern District and Western District of Missouri. Our indictments are now close to 100 through that, and those are violent crimes. And so we want to be part of the solution, and that's what the Safer Streets Initiative is about. Moving forward into the legislative session, there's 2 things that we've advocated for that we think are really important. There is no uniform carjacking statute in the state of Missouri. It can be charged from armed criminal action all the way down to a simple tampering. And what needs to happen is we need to have stiffer penalties for people who are going to engage in that kind of activity. So the legislation would call for a baseline Class B felony, which is 5 years or more. And then if you use a deadly weapon, or it's a special class, or there's a child in the car, it's 10 years to life. And we think that sends a strong message to carjackers that we're serious about this, and that if you're going to do this, you're going to go to jail for a long time. Because look, these are people who, are in some of the more traditionally challenged neighborhoods, which isn't fair to them, but then also, in the mall, in the mall parking lot here in South St. Louis County. So this has reached epidemic levels. In the city of St. Louis alone, last year they had over 360, one a day, and they're on pace to eclipse that. And those numbers are similar in Kansas City and other places too.
So before you go, there was something that I know you cared a lot about. The Cameron schools had an issue where it was odd. It's the kind of thing you read about and you think that's a far off. That's in New York City or something. But you had to step in and help defend Cameron. Tell me how that all came about.
Yeah, I mean, there's an organization called the Freedom From Religion organization. It's an out-of-state extremist anti-religion organization that decided to try to intimidate and bully a local school district, rural school district, who had voluntarily engaged in lawful prayer after football games. But these guys are paper tigers. They send these kinds of letters all over the place, but their intention is to eliminate any discussion of religion from the public square altogether. So they send a letter to the Cameron School District and they say, you better stop this or we're going to sue you. We found out about it and wrote a letter to the Cameron leaders and said, look, we're going to be with you. This is constitutional. This is constitutionally protected free speech, and if they come after you, we're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with you.
Do you think a lot of people, though, a lot of schools, just looking out for their own fiduciary responsibility, their own interest, they will limit the amount of prayer you can have, even past what's legally acceptable, because they're afraid. I mean, you can't know that some lawyer from New York City is not going to charge you $10,000 to fight a lawsuit.
That's exactly right, and that's their intention. That's why they send out so many threatening letters. And again, it's local governments and school districts. They try to intimidate them that they're doing something wrong. And we wanted to be clear. And this story went nationally because we want to make sure that we're standing up for those First Amendment rights for those students. They have a right to do this if they choose to do it. I mean, it's voluntary prayer. And I think it's important for an attorney general to say, listen, my job is to be the lawyer for all 6 million Missourians. And if this extremist anti-religion organization is going to try to intimidate you, we're going to stand up for you, and we're going to help defend those rights.
Speaking of families, what does the Schmitt family have set for Christmas? What's the tradition?
Well, we've got Christmas Eve with my parents. I suppose the German tradition is a Christmas Eve.
And the pickle, yes.
Right, so we've got a lot of that going on with my parents who still live in North County, so we'll be up there with my parents in St. Louis area. But, my kids are, Steven's 15 and Sophia's 9, or I'm sorry, Sophia's 11 and Olivia's 9. So Christmas is still a really, really fun time in our house. They love decorating, and with Thanksgiving being so so kind of late in the year. It's kind of a compressed
Yeah.
time frame, but we're ready. All the shopping is done, but you can thank Jamie Schmitt for that.
What
mostly.
about the shopping for Jamie? Is that done?
Yes.
We're not going to fact check that, but it is true the Germans invented the Christmas tree.
That's right. Although you think about how dry Christmas trees can get, it's a little scary when they're actually lighting candles as they did originally on a sort of a dry
German
Christmas
engineering, they knew what they were doing.
Figured it out.
Well, thank you very much for joining us. We'll hope if we don't see you before, we'll definitely see you next year at the same time.
Good to see you.
Well, we'll be right back with our Opinion Maker panel. Mike Jones joins the show.
All across Missouri, our new car and truck dealers are building strong local economies. When you buy a car or truck in Missouri, you're helping to support over 20,000 Missouri families who rely on the auto industry for good-paying local jobs. You're also helping fund our communities, schools, first responders, and our roads because dealers generate millions of dollars in tax revenue. Missouri's automobile dealers have been the foundation of our communities for generations and for generations to come. The Missouri Automobile Dealers Association.
Your energy needs are changing. That's why at Ameren, Missouri, we're not waiting on the future. We're building it with the Smart Energy Plan, advancing thousands of projects across the state, helping reduce emissions through cleaner energy sources, boost reliability with self-healing equipment, and better withstand storms with new composite poles. Moving Missouri forward and bringing us all a little closer together. That's energy at work. Ameren, Missouri.
Welcome back to this week in Missouri Politics Opinion Maker panel time. The St. Louis Political Institution. Mike Jones, welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you, Scott. Pleasure to be back.
The new editor of the Missouri Times out of Jefferson City, Kaitlyn Schallhorn, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Mary Elizabeth Coleman, Jefferson County, legislator, heading back second year, correct?
That's right.
So it's not sophomore because you get that would be like a year from now.
Yeah, it's like a repeat of the freshman year.
And a person who's spent this last year he'll be serving with you, running for state senate, announced it. I love the video. I love the play and catch with the son. I love how many takes did you have to get? Now be honest here, for your son to hit that target right on.
Actually, that was the first take, and I threw a number of clay pigeons that day when we were shooting the video, and the production crew was amazed at how many clay pigeons my boys broke as we were throwing those out there.
I like how you nailed that. Look, I mean, it looked like first time. We're going to take your word on that.
It was, I promise.
Let's talk about something. You're in a Senate primary. This is a lot of these Senate primaries. There's really not that big a difference. It may be more temperance than it is actual legislative difference.
Sure.
You have a difference, and since we have Mike here on the show, let's talk about education reform. You've served in the House for 7 years. Mm-hmm. For 7 years, people have talked about these proposals and tried to bring them out. What is one that you think might actually work in southern Missouri?
Well, as we look around the state, and I'm going to shift this over to my service on the Budget Committee, frankly,
Sure.
because, for the last, I believe, 4 years, we've fully funded the foundation formula. Personally, I have added to the school transportation funding, which, in the busing, that benefits rural Missouri.
Shout out to Brian Munslinger.
There we go. And so, we've made advances towards education. Within the budget, that needs to be, talked about, and that's something that's going to matter. As far as the different proposals on reform, I've been there for 7 years, and there have been a number of different proposals that have come forth from year to year to year, and thus far, most of those have failed to be, successfully implemented. I believe that every child deserves a quality education. I've supported those things that I think would help education across the state, both in the rural and the urban settings. But at this point, I'm not sure what really has a chance in this next session of getting across the line.
Mr. Coleman, you come from a suburban district. In a rural district, probably really doesn't matter. Most of these things are very theoretical. In a suburban district, this actually matters. Is there one you think might actually be above the others and actually something you could pass in the next 2 to 3 years in the House of Representatives?
Yeah, so I do think that in the next 2 to 3 years, there might be a path forward to do some of this education expansion into charter schools. We've had a big push within our primaries to try to elect people who'd be supportive of school choice. One of the things that's frustrating is parents you're stuck. If you don't get into a magnet school, if you don't get into one of the existing charter schools in the city, you have a hard time getting an alternative choice if that school is not working for your kids. And I think that parents have the right to have the best education for their kid, no matter what zip code they live in. And so I do think that maybe not this year, but certainly in the next 2 to 3 years, we should see that into some of the collar communities around the urban areas.
I've seen this. There's a lot of big plans, and I think they have big plans they want to take to your committee, on the Committee on Education, that would actually implement these things.
No, the commission.
The commission,
The
sorry.
Say board, right.
Commission.
I'm not in one of those august bodies.
Well, it looks pretty
he
august
aspires to and
sometimes.
she's in. Okay.
Let me tell you, though, there's a lot of big plans. When you see something, what is something that you think could happen, that you need state legislative approval for, that you think might actually make a difference in places like where you're from here in St.
Okay,
Louis?
well, the real issue is the legislature in education has been extremely active over the last 3-4 years with standards. So literally digesting what the legislature has produced and getting it executed is a problem. So every time they get an idea and they create legislation, that impacts the system in the sense that it was set to do this, now it has to incorporate some additional changes. So, and the reality is Missouri is a local control state. You should think of the State Board of Education as an accountability body, that based in terms of execution of education
Is there
standards.
one of these proposals you actually think has some merit and would make a difference?
I would argue trying to do something about the funding, and in particular rural transportation, because there is a direct linkage between the ability, and there are urban transportation issues as well. But I would argue that what Missouri needs is about what America needs is an examination of what public education should look like in the 21st century. Now, I'm not offering a proposed solution. I am suggesting that we have a robust discussion of that, because right now we got a 19th century education idea of how education should work in a mid-20th century platform, and we're working in a 21st century environment. So I think that the idea of public education is important, and I don't think privatizing public space is the answer, because I think education
Charter
infrastructure.
schools are public schools, though. That's one of the things that I think people are often saying is charter schools are public schools.
But I would argue that the way we do charter schools in Missouri, we have tendency to privatize the accountability. For me, what makes public schools is they're inside a public accountability system where there are constitutionally set up bodies who are responsible for ensuring the accountability.
I think even Robin Wabi would tell you there's some ways to make charter schools more accountable. But Kaitlyn, you've said and watched the legislature. Now, it looks to me like it's the ultimate Missouri versus Missouri issue. Most Missouri legislators, they like their schools generally, they like their teachers, they like their coaches, and they're not going to have a charter school. So I think it sometimes breaks down in the House. It's hard to convince people in rural Missouri to vote for something their school doesn't want that won't really impact them.
Yeah, I think that's certainly true, and it's true with probably many other issues as well. That's definitely a fight that I found interesting moving to Missouri and covering the legislature, that there was even a difference among Republicans for charter schools versus public schools. Being from, I grew up in Missouri and then moved to South Carolina, and I was lucky enough to go to a really great public school in South Carolina, and there a lot of Republicans are really on board with charter schools, and I didn't even think that was a fight.
Give me a prediction. You go to the Senate.
Well, I just following up on that point right there. So, the reality is this: it may not be a one-size-fits-all solution that we're looking at in this session or in upcoming sessions, because there are things. I have some really great public schools in my neck of the woods. I graduated from public school, and my kids are in school at a public school.
Your Senate district will run about 8 miles from the greatest public school, Neelyville High School, down in West Butler County.
Well, and so it's a concern of mine. We want to make sure that there's absolutely no harm to our good public schools. However, in some of these more urban areas, that maybe a student would benefit from having options like that. We want to make sure that that's there for them as well. So I guess what I'm saying is,
will you leave the Senate, before you leave the Senate, because I think next year's an election year, maybe not be the most ideal thing, will there be an education reform passed that expands charters outside of St. Louis?
The crystal ball is not that bright on that. I have no idea.
I think that it's possible that we'll see it in 3 years.
I think it's like with labor. There were labor Republicans, and now you're recruiting folks that'll vote anti-public schools, and I think that'll be the move over time that'll be successful.
So
you're right.
I came from public schools. My kids receive services in public schools. I don't think that wanting parents to have a choice and having schools that will close if they're not performing means that you're anti-public schools. So I'm going to push back on that.
Will there be a bill passed in the next 2 or 3 years?
Nothing next year. Anything's possible after 20.
You watch this all day, every day. Well, maybe not next year, but will there be in the next 3 years one of these bills passed?
I think there could be. Maybe not as expansive as we're starting out with, but I think there could be.
Let's talk about a bill that it looks like is being loaded up to run through the House quickly. Representative Trent come up with a bill to make it, I guess, constitutionally illegal for illegal immigrants to vote in the state of Missouri. I think maybe some people say, well, can you do that now? And I would assume no. But his bill looks like that's being loaded up to run very early.
It's going to be interesting to hear, some of the different back and forth on this particular issue. Frankly, I can't say that I know of any, illegal citizens that would be, taking part in our elections currently. But I'm interested in hearing the debate surrounding this particular measure and, what numbers are brought forth, as a measure of support or why this is necessarily needed.
Tanya Defendahl down in Butler County doesn't let illegal immigrants vote in Butler County. I assume Jay Ashcroft is against this and wouldn't sign off on this. It seems illegal. What is there was a reason for this, right? There's some cities around the country, maybe San Francisco or somewhere, where they are having illegal immigrants vote in their elections.
That's right. So there's 8 states in Maryland that have allowed this to happen. We've got some of the other 8 cities in the state of Maryland that have allowed this to happen. San Francisco are doing some other things. I just approach this from a really personal way. My grandparents were naturalized citizens, and one of my favorite stories was listening to the story of my grandmother talk about what it meant for her to vote for the first time as a citizen. And I think that it's really important that we protect those rights of citizens. And so there is clearly a concern, or we wouldn't be looking at this issue. I agree. Jay Ashcroft is a very competent Secretary of State. He's doing a great job. But I don't have a problem having the debate. Let's talk about it some more.
What do you think? I mean, it looked like you could just tell by that, you could just read the tea leaves, this is going to be a big deal.
I would say this is Republicans saying round up the usual suspects, Colonel whatever his name has been shot. So, I mean, as from my perspective, you guys have at it, and if that entertains you all for the session, I think that would be great, because you wouldn't get around to doing any other serious damage.
If you were a Democrat in the Missouri Senate and you said, well, if we're going to spend a week putting this on the ballot, it's probably a week we're not doing something that we care about. I don't think Democrats really care, right? Because this is maybe not the most pressing issue.
Right, and I think what Representative Ross said earlier, looking at the numbers, that's going to be a big thing. If this isn't a problem that's already existing, then why do we need to spend time taking care of it? So
do you think Democrats will just let them roll, or will this take a week in the Senate?
I don't know, maybe a day or two.
Yeah, maybe a day or two. Let's talk about something that I don't think could get through the Senate, but like in a lot of other states that are Democrat-controlled, Republicans go to the ballot to see policies they want enacted. Democrats are pulling from that playbook now that Missouri is a very red state. Medicaid expansion is one of these policies. I have to say, just looking, as we sit here 10 months out, it looks like there's going to be money behind it. It looks like it can pass. I don't see the opposition to it. Medicaid expansion, it has to be something that you probably are voting for, right?
I think health care is a human right. So now the question is, how do you get it delivered and executed and funded? But the notion that in a civilized, advanced, in theory, civilized, advanced society, that people don't have access to adequate health care for purely economic reasons, I think any thoughtful person would have a problem with that. So whether if you don't support Medicaid or Medicare expansion, then you need an alternative solution that ultimately does the same things. So yes, I would be for it.
It's an interesting thing, just like where you guys might pass a law that they have to figure out how to implement, the voters may pass a law that House Budget Committee has to figure out how to implement.
Well, and that's exactly. So I've served on the House Budget Committee for 7 years, and we in the state of Missouri, we have a fixed pie that you see the feeding frenzy of the different folks that come in, and we are tasked with prioritizing how the taxpayers' dollars are going to be spent across the state. And if this proposal were to pass, I'm going to tell you right now that it will be either education or transportation or some of the other services that we currently provide that we as a state will not be able to provide financially based on Medicaid expansion swallowing up our budget. I fundamentally disagree with Medicaid expansion simply from this is an expansion of a government program, partially because of what Obamacare broke throughout the healthcare industry. However, when you look at the financial implications of this, it's simply, once that cost burden begins to shift, it's something that we as the state of Missouri cannot afford. And there will be, serious cuts in areas that we otherwise consider as priorities within our state budget currently in the event that Medicaid expansion is passed.
Interesting is this, we talk about charter schools, that's mostly an urban issue. Sure. Rural health care is something that is a rural issue. There's hospitals closing. They're not cutting back, they're shutting the doors.
No, absolutely, and that is a crisis that we have, but I just want to make it clear that when we're talking about Medicaid expansion, what we're talking about is healthy adults purchasing health insurance through the government. And one of the things that we do in Missouri is we fund for the disabled and for children at 300% of the poverty level for Medicaid access. And my concern is that if we expand this to the healthy adult population, that we're doing that on the backs of our children and those who are disabled, and we might see that cut back down to the federally mandated levels. And so I want to make sure that we're protecting the most vulnerable in our society. And it sounds like a nice thing. Let's just let everybody have access to health insurance. But the consequences could be at the cost of those who really need it the most.
This is the real issue I hear people talking about. It's whether you should do it or shouldn't do it, and then how do you pay for it?
Yeah, that's definitely a question, and I think even from your guest last week, that was the topic of conversation. But aside from expansion, I think another thing with Medicaid that we shouldn't maybe turn a blind eye to is changes to it and tweaks to it, potentially with work requirements. We saw just this week in South Carolina, the Trump administration approved some pretty strong work requirements there. And South Carolina is going to be one of the first non-expansion states to implement those. So I think that might be something to pay attention to.
Robert Ross, a Senate candidate with the probably the most sharpshooting son. Who won the week?
I'm going to have to say President Trump. So you've had the U.S. House and the impeachment inquiry that's now turned to they're probably voting on it as we sit here and speak. The reality is this has cemented his 2020 election. President Trump has been doing a fantastic job. There's more individuals that otherwise are not politically interested.
Are you trying to tell me that a lot of folks in Kabul weren't convinced by the impeachment process?
So they see it for the sham that it is. And the reality, so in 2016, he was an unknown as far as the quantity of, how he was going to govern exactly. Now people know Donald Trump. They know what he's going to do. They see, the media. They see the House Democrats going at this. They have cemented his 2020 election based on this vote.
Who won the week?
So I think Rob Dixon did. The GM deal that was just announced on Friday is a wonderful win for the state, and it's better than the deal that the unions were able to get. So I'm going to give this win to
You saying Rob Dixon's going to work for UAW?
Absolutely.
Who won the week?
I'll say Robert for launching a Senate campaign.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to say the dual universes in America obviously won the week because he's sitting on that end, I'm sitting on this end.
Keeps everything balanced.
Wait, I put it like this. Obviously, there's a wormhole someplace that people go
Hopefully
back and forth through, right?
I'm going to say Cersei's back atop the Missouri Capitol this week. I say congratulations, because you really can't matter Missouri politics without a petition to get rid of you or anti-Twitter messages. And I want to thank Terry Biggs from Odessa sending me this terrific pin. It's about President Truman and independence. I want to thank everybody that sends those things. We collect them all and we keep them. And this is our last show of the week, so we'll see you next year on This Week in Missouri Politics.
This Week in Missouri Politics, sponsored by the Missouri Association of Career Fire Protection Districts, Spire, and Sterling Bank.